opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, immediately contesting the center. Initiating the Sicilian defense immediately introduces asymmetrical pawn structures, creating rich tactical and positional battles from the outset. Developing the knight naturally pressures black's pawn and prepares for central pawn advances, a fundamental principle in chess openings. This setup prepares to challenge white's central pawn and opens a diagonal for the queen. Preparing for a fianchetto offers a flexible setup, aiming for long-term influence over the light squares and potentially a kingside attack. Immediately challenging the center with d5 seizes crucial space and forces white to confront the pawn structure. Liberating the d-file opens up attacking possibilities while simplifying the position slightly, offering a clearer path for piece development. Reclaiming the center with the pawn solidifies black's pawn structure and prepares for active piece development. Opening the center aggressively, white aims for rapid development and central control, daring black to seize the initiative. Developing the knight to f6 solidifies the center and prepares for castling, a vital step in securing the king. Developing the bishop to g2 locks in a fianchettoed structure, aiming to control the long diagonal and support the central pawn push with c3 later. Developing the bishop to its natural diagonal prepares for castling and solidifies black's central pawn presence, subtly aiming to reclaim the initiative after white's aggressive pawn push. Castling here secures the king, preparing it for the central skirmishes and allowing the rooks to join the action along the open files, which are likely to emerge soon. Castling secures the monarch on the king side, connecting the rooks and bringing them into play, a fundamental defensive maneuver now safely accomplished. Bolstering the central pawn structure and preparing to challenge black's light-squared bishop's influence, this bishop maneuver neatly connects the rooks and reinforces the knight's central presence. It's a subtle consolidation, aiming to gradually increase white's space and potentially launch a queenside pawn storm later. Liberating the c-file for potential pressure and opening the diagonal for your light-squared bishop offers dynamic counterplay. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight reestablishes immediate material equality and positions that knight centrally, eyeing crucial squares. This knight now serves as a formidable outpost, a shield for your king, and a springboard for future attacks. Black must now carefully consider how to develop their pieces around this imposing knight, lest it become a permanent thorn in their side. Targeting the knight's position with the bishop immediately questions white's central pawn structure, forcing them to clarify their intentions and potentially develop a piece awkwardly to defend. Securing the central pawn structure and preparing a potential kingside assault, this queen repositioning aims to coordinate the rooks and exert pressure on the queen side. The queen assumes a central, protective role, reinforcing the pawn structure and preparing for potential pawn breaks while eyeing the kingside. Reclaiming the e-file with the rook opens vital lines of communication and prepares for potential pawn pushes or piece maneuvering down the center. This knight tucks itself into a central outpost, challenging the dominant white pieces and preparing to potentially swing over to the kingside, adding pressure to the castled position. Stepping the knight back to d2 aims to secure its position while simultaneously clearing the f3 square for a potential pawn push or a later repositioning of the other knight. This feels like a pause for strategic consolidation, allowing white to assess the evolving pawn structure and prepare for the next phase of development, perhaps with the intention of supporting a central pawn advance or creating threats on the queen side. It's a solid, unobtrusive maneuver that prioritizes avoiding immediate weaknesses and building a more robust defensive setup before committing to aggressive intentions. Re-establishing pressure on the open e-file with the rook signifies a shift towards active piece play and prepares for potential breakthroughs. Reasserting central pressure, the knight strategically repositions, aiming to contest the d4 square once more and potentially facilitate a future advance of the pawn on f3, thus shoring up kingside defenses. Unveiling the bishop to d6, black aims to finally challenge white's imposing central pawn structure and potentially prepare for a queenside pawn advance, while also offering a trade that could alleviate some of the pressure on the d-file. A curious repositioning, this queen retreats from the central pressure, aiming to perhaps redeploy on the kingside where white's pawn structure remains slightly more accommodating, or to offer a shield to the castled monarch. Notice how black's pieces, especially the knight on c6 and the rook on e8, now possess a clearer influence over the central files and diagonals, while white's bishop on g2, despite its long-range potential, currently finds its scope somewhat restricted by its own pawns and black's solid development. This could signal a shift towards a more strategic, maneuvering battle, prioritizing piece harmony and pawn structure over immediate confrontation, but it also leaves white's queen somewhat passively placed for the moment. The bishop embarks on an intriguing journey to h5, aiming to unsettle white's knight on f3 and potentially create weaknesses around the king's defenses by indirectly targeting the f2 pawn. This maneuver also frees up the g7 bishop, which can then participate more actively in the fight for the center. It's a subtle positional adjustment, a quiet aspiration to disrupt white's pawn structure and open up lines for future attacks, hinting at a strategic shift towards a more aggressive posture. Initiating an aggressive pawn thrust at c4, white immediately challenges black's central pawn chain and seeks to seize more territory on the queenside. This move aims to disrupt black's harmonious development and create imbalances for tactical play. The intention is to open lines for white's pieces, potentially targeting black's king's safety later. It's a decisive step, forcing black to react and clarifying the strategic direction of the game toward a more dynamic and potentially sharp encounter, where precise calculation will be paramount. Sacrificing the immediate kingside pawn structure for long-term defensive solidity, this move by black seeks to dissuade white's aggressive intentions on the g-file and create a more robust pawn barrier, though it does introduce a potential weakness on g6 that could be exploited later if white can maneuver pieces to target it. Initiating control of the open c-file solidifies white's presence in black's territory, creating pressure that could eventually lead to a pawn weakness or forced concessions. Boldly claiming the open d-file with the rooks, this maneuver signals a desire for active piece play and potentially preparing for a central breakthrough, simultaneously reinforcing the knight on c6 and eyeing potential advances for the remaining pieces. Clearing the way for the queen's bishop to join the queenside pressure, this maneuver subtly prepares to expand white's pawn structure and restrict black's maneuvering room. Retreating the bishop to b8 is a subtle sidestep, aiming to untangle the queenside and potentially reposition for future play, perhaps supporting a future queenside pawn push or avoiding immediate threats from white's advanced pieces. Pushing the b-pawn here aggressively aims to disrupt black's kingside structure and potentially gain valuable queenside space, a bold gambit to seize the initiative and expand influence in a cramped position. Black liberates the diagonal for the king's bishop, sacrificing a pawn to disrupt white's centralized control and create immediate tactical potential on the queenside. A bold reclaiming of the central tension, this queen sortie immediately challenges black's pawn structure and seeks to exploit the newfound open lines for rapid development and potential piece activity, a deliberate shift towards active counterplay after a period of careful maneuvering. The intricate dance of pieces has led to a pivotal moment where the threat of the knight fork on c2 is now palpably present, forcing a reevaluation of the queenside structure and potentially sacrificing material for a more active position. Reclaiming the attacked knight opens up multiple avenues, and this recapture, while seemingly straightforward, immediately recenters your central presence and prepares for potential pawn pushes on the kingside or a quick rook maneuver. Notice how the knight's return to its original square subtly repositions it to contest the d-file and support a future c-pawn advance, creating a more cohesive structure. The knight's leap to d5 injects dynamism, immediately challenging white's central pawn structure and creating a complex web of tactical possibilities. This aggressive placement forces white to make difficult decisions about the knight's safety and its impact on the surrounding pieces. Consider the bishop on g2. It's no longer comfortably surveying the long diagonal. Black is actively fighting for central influence and opening lines for their own pieces. The queen's diagonal repositioning on the b-file immediately targets the misplaced knight on d5, forcing black to address the threat directly or face material loss. This proactive approach injects immediate tactical tension, aiming to disrupt black's recently solidified central pawn structure and potentially open up lines towards the kingside. Sacrificing the bishop for a pawn and disrupting white's kingside structure is a bold, almost desperate attempt to gain initiative. Trading queens here streamlines the position, aiming to pressure black's isolated pawn structure and exploit the open d-file with rook support. The pawn structure is now locked, and the fight for central squares intensifies as black repositions the rook to its newly liberated file, aiming to contest its occupation. Reclaiming the rook onto an open file, this maneuver prepares for a likely pawn advance, potentially opening lines for the bishop, and creating a dynamic imbalance on the queenside where the enemy rook is currently somewhat passive. The material is now level, but the open files, particularly the d-file, present a dynamic opportunity for black to exert influence, while white's rook on e3, though active, lacks immediate defensive duties and could become a target. Transforming the pawn structure opens up the f-file for the rook, hinting at potential pressure down that path, while simultaneously solidifying the central pawn mass. Reclaiming the initiative, black repositions the bishop, eyeing the now exposed light squares around white's king and preparing to contest the d-file. Activating the king in this simplified structure is a pragmatic choice, aiming to bring it into the game before black can fully consolidate their pieces. Solidifying your pawn structure and preparing for potential kingside action, this move anchors your king's safety while acknowledging the queenside pawn weakness. Unleashing the rook to the 8th rank immediately seizes the open file and places the black king under immediate scrutiny, forcing a defensive reaction and limiting his mobility significantly. A vital defensive maneuver to shield the king and prepare for the inevitable advance of white's rook. Consolidating the bishop's influence by repositioning it to a more central and active square, this maneuver aims to improve its scope and prepare for potential queenside expansion by the white pawns, while simultaneously bolstering the pawn structure's solidity around the king. Sacrificing a bishop for the advantage of opening the d-file and potentially creating a passed pawn is a bold proposition in this endgame. However, the resulting pawn structure on the kingside could become a significant weakness for black, and white's queen is well positioned to exploit it. The pawn structure is irrevocably altered. A central pawn chain has dissolved, paving the way for a more open board where piece activity will be paramount. Shifting the bishop to this active diagonal from its previous post on h5 is a smart way to redeploy pressure, aiming to disrupt white's nascent pawn chain and potentially creating threats against the now exposed king. Unleashing a powerful discovered check, white forces black's king into a more exposed position, creating immediate tactical complications and potentially opening lines for further attack. This aggressive maneuver disrupts black's coordinated pieces and signals a shift towards a more dynamic phase of the game where king's safety becomes paramount. The pressure on the f-file intensifies, and black must react precisely to avoid further concessions. The black monarch steps into the limelight, a daring excursion aimed at unblocking the knight and potentially creating a connected passed pawn down the file, while simultaneously seeking sanctuary from white's now more active bishop. Securing the king with a crucial check before further material decisions is paramount. Prioritizing king's safety becomes paramount as the dust settles. Relocating the monarch to the more secure 7th rank offers immediate protection from further checks and prepares for potential peace exchanges that could expose it. The king's exposed position after the recent exchanges becomes a prime target, forcing black into a defensive posture that allows white to solidify their central pawns and prepare for a kingside advance. Shifting the king to this square, while seemingly active, allows white's bishop to pivot and potentially create new attacking lines, rather than consolidating the position or preparing to defend the pawn weaknesses that have emerged. Pushing the bishop again to e4 forces black's king into a further compromised position, creating a zugzwang-like scenario where any move black makes will likely weaken their pawn structure or king safety. Exploring a repetition offers a moment to reassess, a chance to regroup amidst the unfolding endgame. The rook slides to the open file, aiming to exploit the pawn structure's weaknesses and potentially create mating threats on the kingside if black's king remains exposed after subsequent maneuvers. Bolstering the queenside pawn structure with b6 solidifies black's position against white's encroaching rook, preventing any immediate breakthroughs while preparing to develop the queenside minority. Liberating that pawn opens a vital central diagonal for the queen and threatens to march towards promotion, forcing black to actively defend against its advance rather than developing their own pieces further. Safeguarding the king's sanctuary becomes paramount as the central pawn structure solidifies, forcing a strategic reassessment of piece deployment and potential pawn breaks. The king, finally emerging from its protective shell, now ventures onto the central stage, aiming to seize a more active role in the unfolding endgame by asserting its presence on the e3 square. The rook's repositioning to the d-file immediately capitalizes on the recent pawn push, aiming to reclaim material advantage and disrupt white's central pawn structure before the king can fully participate in the defense. Reclaiming the open d-file with the bishop opens up possibilities for a coordinated attack, aiming to exploit the pinned knight and the weakened kingside pawns. Reasserting the rook's presence on the 7th rank offers a vital respite, challenging white's king and potentially creating complications on the d-file if white isn't careful, while also preparing for future pawn pushes. Elevating the rook's reach, this pawn push proactively secures crucial squares and prepares to push the queenside pawns, creating potential for queenside space and an advantage. The rook's repositioning aims to challenge white's central pawn thrust, seeking to disrupt its advance and potentially open lines for counterplay along the now freed c-file. Opening the g-file with the rook suddenly creates significant pressure on black's king, aiming to exploit the awkward placement of his pieces and the exposed pawn structure. Exploring the intricate paths of the endgame, black's king bravely ventures towards the center, seeking a more active role in maneuvering pawns and potentially defending weakened squares. This proactive stance contrasts with white's strategic placement of the rook on the 7th rank, a classic endgame pressure point. The game hinges on black's ability to coordinate his pieces effectively and create counterplay before white's pawn majority on the queenside, now bolstered by the advanced rook, becomes overwhelming. Unleashing the rook to the 7th rank forces the black king into a perpetually exposed position, significantly diminishing its defensive capabilities and creating immediate tactical threats on the king's side of the board. Pivoting that bishop to d7 aims to reroute it to a safer square, perhaps c6 or e8, away from the immediate threat of the rook, while also reinforcing the d-pawn. Seizing the initiative on the queenside, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn, thereby opening new avenues for the white rooks. Embracing the pawn sacrifice to gain the open, a file is a bold strategic decision. This maneuver aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create dynamic counterplay on the queenside, offering a chance to unbalance the position and fight for initiative. Capturing the pawn opens the b-file for the rook, creating immediate pressure on black's queenside pawns and disrupting their coordinated defense. The rook's repositioning to the open file aims to pressure white's passed pawn, but it also leaves the 7th rank vulnerable to a potential infiltration if white can consolidate their pieces effectively. The open file created by the exchange of rooks now becomes the primary battleground, and black's bishop on c8 is awkwardly placed, unable to actively participate in defending the pawns. The bishop now anchors the defense of the king, preventing further pawn advances and creating a solid wall against white's rooks, though it does restrict the rook's mobility somewhat. The monarch now ventures out, aiming to become a central player in the unfolding endgame dynamics, potentially supporting pawn advances or disrupting enemy structure. Opening up the king's diagonal for the rook on b8 creates a crucial escape square, potentially allowing the black monarch to evade the menacing white pawn push and find safer refuge as the game transitions into a complex endgame. The bishop repositions to a more active diagonal, eyeing the potential weaknesses that have emerged around black's kingside pawns. Steering the pawn structure toward a more solidified shape, black aims to grant the king a touch more breathing room, a subtle but important consideration with the remaining pieces so active on the board. Aiming to activate the bishop and press the advantage on the queen side, this repositioning of the piece will exert pressure along the third rank and potentially support a future pawn push. Activating the bishop to a more aggressive diagonal offers potential for counterplay and challenges white's consolidated pawn structure, though it does leave the pawn on f6 a bit exposed. Asserting dominion over the queenside diagonal, this bishop repositions to eye the crucial kingside squares, aiming to stifle any burgeoning pawn activity and potentially support future advances, while maintaining a vigilant watch on the central pawns. The pawn advance on the kingside attempts to gain breathing room and potentially create counterplay, but it neglects the inherent weaknesses that arise from advancing such a pawn in this particular pawn structure. The bishop now repositions, eyeing the pawn structure and preparing to influence the central squares if the opportunity arises. The bishop now aims for the kingside, a strategic redeployment to eye the weak f5 pawn and potentially create past pawn threats on that flank as the game simplifies. Exploring the possibility of the bishop establishing a dominant outpost on b3, aiming to restrict the black pawn structure's mobility and potentially creating mating threats against the king's exposed position. The bishop's return to c6 offers a subtle improvement in piece coordination, reinforcing the queenside and preparing to contest the open file should it materialize further. Shifting the bishop to c2 aims to secure the pawn chain and eye potential pawn advances on the queen side, potentially supporting a future upon push to restrict black's bishop. Unleashing a pawn storm offers a glimmer of hope, but the path forward feels precarious with that doubled f-pawn. Opening up the g-file unleashes potential for your king's pawn, but it simultaneously grants black's rook greater activity and control over that now open column. The pawn advance on the kingside cracks open black's defenses, aiming to exploit the now open g-file and create mating threats against the exposed enemy monarch. Unlocking the bishop's diagonal pressure while simultaneously preparing to advance the passed pawn marks a crucial strategic shift, aiming to exploit the open lines created by the recent exchanges and put black's king under increasing pressure. The pawn push forward creates immediate pressure, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially open up lines for black's remaining pieces, though it also leaves a potential weakness on the e-file that white might exploit. This is a pawn push that opens up a diagonal for the king, aiming to solidify its position against black's increasingly active pieces and perhaps create a protected passed pawn later on. A strategic retreat to safety, the bishop repositions to a square where it's shielded and ready to influence the queenside pawns, creating a solid defensive barrier and preparing for potential counterplay against white's still centralized king. Clearing the d-file allows the king to finally step out of the shadows and participate in the unfolding endgame battle, aiming for central influence. The monarch bravely ventures towards the center, seeking influence in a board that's rapidly simplifying, aiming to anchor itself before the pawn structure further solidifies or collapses. Bringing the bishop back to d3 solidifies the pawn structure on the queenside and prepares to support a potential pawn push with c4, aiming to expand white's space and restrict black's pieces. Relocating the monarch to the center, this maneuver aims to activate the king and potentially participate in the pawn skirmishes, a bold choice given the relative safety of the queenside. Re-establishing the bishop on its more active diagonal after the pawn exchange on f3 creates a strong central outpost and prepares to regroup the pieces for potential breakthroughs. The bishop tucks back, a passive defensive posture that allows white's kingside pawns to advance unimpeded, creating a dangerous outpost for the coming attack. The king, finding unexpected safety on the e-file, now spearheads a tentative push, aiming to solidify its newfound central presence and survey the evolving pawn landscape. The bishop repositions, seeking a more active diagonal to pressure white's pawns, even if it means temporarily stepping away from defending the kingside. Stepping the king into this central outpost leverages its newfound activity, threatening to disrupt black's pawn structure and create infiltration opportunities. The black king, now freed from its protective pawn structure, dances towards the center, a calculated risk that could either solidify its central presence or expose it to a swift white attack, depending on how accurately the remaining pieces are coordinated. The king, finally venturing out from its protective pawn shield, begins its endgame march towards the center, aiming to support the advancing pawns and restrict black's bishop. Pushing the king further into the opponent's territory, this maneuver attempts to leverage the open lines and the weakened pawn structure on the queenside to create an immediate threat, aiming to exploit the king's compromised position before white can consolidate their forces. Re-establishing centralization of the monarch is paramount, aiming to activate it from its current passive position on the edge and prepare for the inevitable pawn race. Initiating a vital repositioning of the monarch to a more central and active role, aiming to leverage its presence for potential pawn promotion and defensive support as the endgame unfolds. Advancing the pawn to a6 is a crucial step to further restrict black's bishop and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside, a significant advantage in this endgame. Stepping the king onto the open file is a desperate attempt to find refuge, but it walks directly into a net of white's pieces, potentially isolating itself further from any supporting pawns. Solidifying the king's position at the center of the board now offers white the best chance to capitalize on black's somewhat exposed monarch. King centralization is paramount in this endgame, and stepping the monarch onto the 6th rank now allows it to exert influence across a broader swathe of the board, preparing to support the queenside pawn push while eyeing potential weaknesses in white's formation. Establishing control of the central dark squares, the bishop aims to restrict black's f-pawn's advance and prevent any kingside counterplay, reinforcing white's positional advantage. Introducing a new pawn threat with this advance, black seeks to activate a dormant piece and potentially disrupt white's central pawn structure, forcing a reaction before further consolidation. A crucial moment unfolds as the king ventures forth, aiming to secure the pawn and potentially create a passed pawn of its own. Unlocking the bishop's influence, this maneuver aims to reposition the piece to a more active diagonal, potentially creating future threats against white's king or supporting pawn advances. Capturing the pawn with the king now solidifies white's central presence and prepares to activate the monarch further, aiming to exploit black's somewhat passive bishop and potentially create passed pawns on the queenside as the game transitions into a king-and-pawn endgame. The bishop finally finds a stable perch on the queenside, eyeing the potential weakness of white's advanced pawn chain while preparing to support a kingside push. The bishop shifts to c2, a subtle repositioning aiming to shore up the pawn chain and prepare for potential rook activity on the c-file, while also keeping an eye on the d4 square, a key central outpost. Capturing the pawn opens a direct confrontation for control of the a-file, which will now be crucial in determining the pace of white's queenside pawn push. The king steps out to join the action, a bold decision that aims to support the advanced pawn and potentially escort it towards promotion, while also keeping a watchful eye on the central squares. A vital reassessment of piece activity unfolds as the black king ventures into the exposed territory of the queenside, a calculated risk that could either solidify control or invite immediate counterplay. Consolidating your monarch into the relative safety of the d-file allows for better coordination with your remaining pieces, preparing to support the pawn's advance. Pushing the king forward to square b4 attempts to centralize it and exert influence on the queenside pawn structure. Bringing the king towards the center now aims to occupy a commanding position to support the pawns and restrict black's bishop. Pushing the pawn now begins a crucial race to create a passed pawn and potentially disrupt white's king's safety as it ventures further into enemy territory. Unleashing the passed pawn's potential now solidifies white's winning advantage by creating an immediate threat that black cannot ignore. The bishop now eyes the kingside majority, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and perhaps support a breakthrough. Sensing the imminent danger of the black pawn's advance, white initiates a crucial defensive maneuver by repositioning the monarch towards the king's flank, aiming to block the powerful bishop's access and prepare for potential pawn structure consolidation. Unleashing the bishop from its temporary sanctuary on h5, black aims to activate this piece for the endgame, seeking to create counterplay against white's advancing king and potentially disrupt its central control. The king bravely advances, aiming to occupy the central squares and support the pawn push. Unleashing the bishop to its final resting square on the queen side, this maneuver seeks to block white's advancing king and offer a tantalizing outpost for the dark-squared bishop, aiming to disrupt any further regal infiltration towards the central squares.